Hello and welcome back to the Claret podcast. I'm your host for this one, Dan Rolinson, and I'm joined by the Athletics' Jon Mackenzie to talk about Aston Villa being good at football. It's always good to do this. We did a podcast together earlier in the season. I've just double-checked. It was the 20th of November, and it was titled Aston Villa are genuine contenders for the top four, which we've just been discussing, John, before we hit record. We went a little bit early there, didn't we, with a kind of definite?
Yeah, very early. At that point, Villa were fifth. It was 12 games into the season. They were only a point behind Spurs at that point, 4 points ahead of Manchester United. But yeah, it doesn't sound like me to go so big so early, but it's nice to see that prediction sort of worked its way out. And I guess we said they're contenders, so if they'd been there and thereabouts, it would have been fine too. But yeah, it's great to see Villa in the Champions League. And yeah, really excited to talk about Villa with you, as I always am.
I pick the titles, don't I? So I was probably going not clickbait, but kind of like I'll go bold here early in the season. But we felt it, we believed it as Villa fans. We just got off the period where we got Fulham, Luton, and Forest in the space of a week, and you think, yeah, easy-ish games, but you sort of go and do it. And Villa got maximum points. And it was like, okay, like where if you can beat all the worst teams pretty much, and you can nick results here and there against the ones above you, you are going to be a contender for the top four, which is what we discussed back then, and it came to fruition, which is absolutely lovely. And I still pinch myself when we have to talk about it, especially when other people come onto the show and they're like Champions League Villa. It's like, oh yeah, like this is proper now. This is serious. We've got some audience questions that we're going to go through today, John. But just before we get into that, just a couple of points to get us going. What made Villa so good last season from your perspective?
You have a great manager, has a great plan, has great players to be able to enact that plan. And we really saw the benefits of, I think, Unai Emery's attention to detail last season. So yeah, for me, very, very simple thing, really. To be able to compete at that level in the Premier League, you need to have that balance of great system, great players, got a great squad as well, which we'll go on to talk about in terms of squad depth, I think, as we go through it. But yeah, really simple answer from me. In that respect, we've seen a system that works from Villa this season. Maybe signs that it's dropping off a little bit towards the end of this season, which I think is the reality at the top level in any football league. But we can talk about that as we go.
This is kind of venturing into the hypothetical a little bit, but how much of that is down to Unai Emery specifically? Could another manager have done the job he did, do you think?
Yes, another manager could, but the list of managers who could do that, I think, in such a short amount of time, I think it's worth talking about resources as well. It's not easy to come into a club, turn things around without having a huge amount of financial backing, which is not being what's the case necessarily at Villa. Although you obviously have the ability to buy big players. But when I look at Villa and the Villa that Unai Emery's built, it's been built on many of the pieces that were already there when he arrived. Yeah. And, you know, that as someone who focuses on the tactical aspects, it's really nice to see a manager come in and almost problem solve a squad and find a system that works for his players. We've seen it a few times now where he's had to tweak the structure to make up for missing players through injury. But yeah, I think that's what you get from Emery, right? We've seen it at every club that he goes to. He does implement these tactical ideas, gets the most out of a squad, and I'm looking forward to seeing how things evolve at Villa going forwards as a result.
I think it's also worth touching on how Villa juggled the European commitments. They obviously were the only British side to go as far as they did. Ultimately, it doesn't lead to any silverware, and the semi-final is a bit of a damp squib as well, I suppose, in the way that pans out. But to do what they did in the league and get to a European semi-final probably goes under the radar a little bit outside of the Villa bubble. Yeah,
potentially. I mean, I guess the elephant in the room here is that I think you guys had 56 games this season, and you used a base squad of around 14 players. That's a lot of expectation on players from a physical point of view. And we'll go on to talk about squad depth, no doubt going forwards. But I suppose for me, the big question is, why did you drop out of the Conference League? Sorry, at that late stage, because it felt as though you were going into that game against Olympiacos that you were going to be the favourites to win the tournament. But that's something we can talk about. But yeah, I think relatively speaking, has done a good job. But I think the issue is definitely the squad depth. He hasn't been able to rely hugely on depth players, and I think the system is built so much around what he has available in the first 11 that sometimes you get scenarios where Yuri Tielemans, for example, gets injured as he did against Chelsea, and you have to then move John McGinn into that space, and then you have to move someone into John McGinn's space. You lose a fullback, and you have to then start playing. I mean, you play Ezri Konsa as a fullback on that side. A lot of the time, it feels to me as though when you are having to solve an injury issue, it means that you're weakening your options elsewhere, as well as bringing in someone who maybe would be playing in a different role as well. So I think there's definitely issues there with the sort of depth that you had available. I think Boubacar Kamara being out has impacted you as well in that respect. So I think that I personally would probably have wanted to see you go all the way to the end in Europe, but I understand that there are reasons why that didn't happen. So in terms of squad rotation, I think that's one of the hardest things for managers to get right. One of the coaches this season who has rotated his squad the best is Xabi Alonso at Bayer Leverkusen, and we all saw what their season ended up doing. Pep Guardiola is a traditionally very good rotational coach, and when I see something like a coach, only playing 14 base players in a 56 game season, I do wonder whether or not there could have been more done to try and spread the minutes around. But interested to hear your thoughts on that, actually.
Yeah, I think the group core of the 14 that you say, maybe 15, 16 are good. When you're hit with as many injuries that we were towards the back end of the season, that core becomes obviously a lot smaller, and then you get to a stage where your substitution options are the likes of Callum Chambers, and at that level, it's not in keeping with where Villa are expected to be. And obviously, the transfer window is here now, and something we won't talk about on this episode, but one we've been linked with recently is Ross Barkley making a return. There's a little bit of kind of turning your nose up at that a little bit, I've seen from some Villa fans, and it might not be the most sexy, attractive signing. But to me, it was kind of like, well, in that back end of the season, when you're making a substitution, you need to change the game. Would I rather a Ross Barkley come on or a Callum Chambers? I think we got to that level where we were right down to we have no options here. It's interesting you mentioned about like how one substitution changes multiple positions. I'm only bringing this up because I watched it last night, the 99 documentary on Amazon. Have you seen it yet?
I haven't seen it. No.
It's very, very good. It's worth a watch. Before my time, the 99 European Cup final, I was only 4.
Making me feel old here.
But they were talking about how they played Beckham centrally and Giggs off the right, and the kind of the balance wasn't there. And Gary Neville was talking about, well, we've got the connections that we built all season. We're not playing in those same styles or the same patterns. And just changing one position has meant that a couple of players now feel like, I don't know what I'm doing here, because we don't have the same kind of chemistry that we normally would have. So the things that like Tielemans off, so McGinn comes in, so that means maybe Diaby plays right, so Bailey plays here, and you've got one injury, changes 3 or 4 positions, and the players will be thinking, my kind of instinctive rhythm that I normally have with these couple of players isn't there, and all of a sudden Villa look a little bit lost at times. But I don't want that to come across as a criticism, because obviously we've done what we set out to do by finishing 4th. But you feel like if we'd not had those injuries, even just 1 or 2 less, I think maybe we could have got to the final, or we could have finished 3rd even. Do you know what I mean? Like we could have achieved even better than we did.
Some big injuries as well. I think losing Buendia on the eve of the season, Jacob Ramsey not being available for most of the season. Those are massive injuries if you're a squad like Villa's, because those are key players who you just don't feel as though the next player down in both those positions is going to, even though you've got good players, is going to be anywhere near the level of those two as well. So I feel the difficulty. I don't want to just come out here and say, Emery should have rotated more, because a lot of that was out of his hands. But I do think that the really good managers are the ones who, so for example, Xabi Alonso, I mentioned before, used his Europa League slots to actually bring through players that he knew he was going to have to bring in because of the African Cup of Nations. So he almost treated the group stages of the Europa League as a way of being able to, iron out some of the problems early on, so that when those players eventually had to come in, that they were already being used. It obviously a lot easier for Pep Guardiola to do that when he has like backup players in each position that you would be happy starting at any Premier League team as well. So, but I think this is what the challenge of squad building is and what the challenge of modern management is. Like we complain all the time about there being too many games. That's the reality. But managers who can make the most of a bad hand are the ones who do well. So it'll be interesting to see what Villa do in terms of bulking out the squad and then seeing what Emery does next season. If he's given a lot more players and then still relies on a base of players that is maybe too small, then questions to be raised. But I think at this point, we'll have to just wait and see what happens.
Let's get into some of these audience questions then. We'll start from Nick, who says, our underlying numbers have nosedived since March. Does John think this is a personnel issue with the amount of injuries that we've had, or has he noticed structural issues within the system that may carry over into next season?
Yeah, I got some of our data guys to run just a rolling XG for and against chart. Those charts where there's like blue patches when your XG is higher than your XGA, and then the red patches where it's the other way around. And looking at this on a rolling basis, it seems as though around match week 20 something happened defensively that just made your numbers skyrocket a little bit, and then after about match week 25, for whatever reason, the attacking numbers dropped off a little bit as well. So I think from what I see, a lot of the Villa fans want to just say tiredness started kicking in, which I get, and I think is there are questions to be raised about that. But I do always think that these sorts of things are almost always holistic. There's almost always other things going on there. One of the things that I've noticed watching a lot of the more recent games back is, I guess, a couple of issues. One of them is one that I think a lot of Villa fans have clocked, which is sometimes box defending is a little bit shonky. So a little bit of weakness when it comes to defending the box, particularly from wide areas, so crosses coming into the box. A number of reasons for that. Just one is personnel. You don't have a great amount of headers. Good headers, good aerial presences in the back line. Tyrone Mings is, I think, again, a question that's going to be brought up in a little while, but him missing is a massive aspect to that as well. But I would say as well, sometimes when we mentioned Kamara already, often you obviously play with a double pivot. The whole idea is you have these good players under pressure who can help bait in opposition presses, move the ball around, and then create space in behind to move the ball into. And I think just a couple of the sorts of players who are going to be good in those positions are often not going to be great defensively in the air, right? So, for example, Jon McGinn, Yuri Tielemans, when it comes to box defending, one thing that I've been watching when I've been looking back over the last few games is what happens when they're in a scenario where the opposition are now in a position where they are probably going to get cross in. What do those two players do? How do they drop into the back line? What are the back line behaviours like? And I think sometimes both of those players can be a little bit slow to get back into the back line in those scenarios, which again, I think is fair enough when you're talking, two players who you wouldn't think of as about being necessarily like defensive midfielders. Douglas Luiz as well to a degree. But then the other thing is that a lot of your system is built around baiting the press in, as we've said, and then finding those punch passes into central areas or half space passes into one of the wide players who's a little bit narrower. And I think those are very high risk passes. So what I've started seeing, I think, a little bit more recently is oppositions being aware of the fact that is the out ball a lot of the time. And so if you can step up quickly into those players in the spaces, getting ahead of the player receiving, you then win the ball with Villa in quite an open structure. And then you can quickly counter in those scenarios as well. And again, that's when maybe sometimes the two central midfielders are a little bit slow getting into the back line from those wide areas as well. So I do think there are some tactical issues that are in play around why maybe the defensive numbers have got a little worse. The other thing to mention is I've been getting a hint of a suspicion that Villa maybe have game state problems. What I mean by that is that when you go up in games, it's very hard for you then to moderate the tempo of the game because the way you play is so transitional. So I'm thinking, again, the Chelsea game I mentioned before. In that game, you go 2-0 up. and you end up drawing 2-2. And part of the problem is that Yuri Tielemans goes off injured, and so the control and tempo is impacted by that. But you also, the way that you guys control possession of the ball is deep in your own half, playing it around with the goalkeeper. And if a team presses up high, then often the solution is to end up going long. And then you have, if you play those quick balls forward, you're relying on your strikers to do good hold up play and then bring the other players in. It ends up becoming really quite stretched quite quickly. So in that game against Chelsea, the second half was very like end to end against a team like Chelsea, who are built, there's £1 billion worth of players available. Whatever you think of Chelsea, they have players who are going to be fantastic in those scenarios. And it just then felt that you lost control of that game because you had no way of being able to actually retain possession of the ball. So I think as well, maybe teams realizing that and thinking, if we allow them to possess the ball at the back, pass it around and just sort of mid-block against them, we allow them to control the game. If we push up and try and press them high, that will open the game up so that the ball will end up going backwards and forwards a little bit more, and there'll be openings for us to exploit. So I guess going forward, my question would be like, what will Emery's solution to that be? Because obviously so much of this comes down to the actual the tactical approach, and there will have to be some kind of evolution so that you can shift from being a team where you are, and look, you get the benefits of that against most teams in the Premier League. That sort of game would suit you as well because you're a good transition side. But yeah, in games against some of the top teams, if those games become transitional, you could struggle, I think. And interestingly, just as a sort of context thing here, wins against Arsenal, wins against Man City, both of whom are quite, I would say, risk averse. So in those games, they're happy to accept a much more settled game, which works in your favor, right? Because then you will be able to control the ball at the back and sort of sit deep and hit them on the break. But interestingly, that a team like Chelsea, who've equally done the same thing to Man City, I think, where their risk aversion has been punished. But I think in those top games, I think it suited you, the fact that they're not really going to press press super high and try and put you to the sword in a game that comes really open, because they'll be thinking, we could get hurt in those games. But I think the reality is for a club that have a really elite squad, making the game more end to end is always going to suit you if you have the better players. Okay, maybe you'll lose, but for the most part, you probably will win. That's a gamble that neither Pep Guardiola or Mikel Arteta really want to take. But we saw it from Mauricio Pochettino, and I thought that sort of thing caused you guys problems. So just another thing to keep in mind about how do we not. I'm not saying obviously that you have to become like Man City and Arsenal and have this, because what they have is an ability to squeeze the opposition deep through ball possession, right? So they almost create their own, the opposition's low block to then try and break down. The reason why they do that is because they know in those scenarios that, okay, it's going to be harder for us to actually score, but it is going to be much easier for us to defend and control the ball. So I'm interested to see whether or not we see from Villa in the next few seasons under Emery an ability to actually play that way, to possess the ball but higher up the pitch. And in that way, you'll be able to control games a little better. It will happen naturally, I think, with some of the teams at the bottom of the table, because they'll be like, Villa are good, so we're more likely to just sit in a low block anyway. So then the question is, how do you break down those low blocks? But it's a really important aspect as well, I think, from a possessional point of view, to actually be able to defend with the ball. So yeah, that's my thoughts on why maybe we saw the defensive numbers get a little bit worse. In terms of the attacking numbers, I don't really know, because like I say, like after about match week 25, there's like the numbers just sort of plummet a little bit, and whether or not that is just because of the fatigue, lack of squad depth, etc., I don't know. But it could also just be the case that the defensive numbers are getting worse, and so you're much less likely to commit players forward to in attacks. But I wouldn't like to say. Yeah,
it's high risk, high reward, isn't it? With Emery, we know what we're getting ourselves into, and when it works, you're going to score goals and win games, and when it doesn't, you're going to concede goals and you're going to lose games. quite simple as that, really. There's still a little bit of naivety there with some of the players, some of the defensive work, some of maybe concentration or things like that are just off a little bit, where you think that was too easy there for the opposition. And with time, I think those things will improve. It's a second pre-season for Emery coming up. That was only his first full season with us. Obviously, he joined in November of 2022, so quite a long time of that season. But that was only his first full season. When we've got more players available, all these kind of things, you think, well, that and that adds up to another 10% that Villa should probably be better. So you'd like to think that some of the things will just be ironed out naturally over time rather than massive causes for concern. I'm going to do the next two questions in one. John says, will Mings be the answer to our defensive and in particular set-piece woes? And Dave says, can you ask John about defending wide areas as we are at it? As John loves out of possession shape, what players could Villa get or use to identify and fix that issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's the stuff that I was talking about before when it comes to balls in from wide areas, like backline behaviours against teams usually in sort of settled scenarios. I suppose I'm just thinking whether or not some of this comes down to the high line stuff that people always talk about with Villa. You mentioned just actually at the end of the last question that concentration maybe drops, and like the way that Villa defend requires concentration all the time. So again, yeah, that could explain why the defensive numbers rose a little bit, because when you play a high line, people talk about high lines in such a naive way. There was so much talk about Man City, Man City's high line against Man United in the FA Cup final, and people saying, "Oh, is the problem Man City, playing a high line?" And those sorts of like statements really annoy me, because playing a high line, if you concede a goal in behind from playing a high line, you're ignoring all of the advantages you get from playing a high line, which as a Villa fan you'll know all about. But playing a high line isn't just about where your line is; it's about what the lines in front of your high line are doing to make sure that that you're not being left open, right? So if you're playing a high line and you're putting zero pressure on the ball, then you're under a huge amount of pressure immediately, because what you're doing is you're saying to a professional footballer, here you go, here's a dead ball situation for you to find a ball in behind the back line, and we'll have a race between our centre backs and your centre forward. Obviously very risky, but the high line that Villa use, and Emery's on record saying this, I've made videos about this, but you have triggers for what you should be doing, that each member of the back line should be doing whenever the opponent has the ball. And if the opponent has the ball and isn't under any pressure, then that's usually a trigger to drop your line. So your line becomes less high at that point. Yeah. But if that player is under pressure, you keep the line high, because it's harder for them to play a good ball in behind. And more often than not, your offside trap will work. And there's all these kinds of triggers that are in place. Incidentally, in the FA Cup final, Manchester City's triggers on the high line were bad, which is why they got caught out behind, because they'd lost concentration. They were not playing the level that they'd been playing through the season. So concentration, I think, comes into that. But I wonder sometimes as well whether or not that means that in the wide areas, I'm not really looked into this too much, but you'll have triggers in the wide areas as well. When the opposition get to a certain point on the pitch, usually in a wide area, that will just trigger the back line to then box defend. So whatever's happening, they'll then get into the box and defend it. I've already talked about how sometimes I think that the centre midfielders are a little bit slow getting back into that back line to help out. Also, like, there's personnel issues here. We've talked about Pau Torres, fantastic ball carrying centre back, but ball playing centre back, but not a great aerial defender. And I think Diego Carlos as well, not as good as he looks like he should be from an aerial point of view. Tyrone Mings, obviously fantastic in that respect. So yes, he will help out in that respect. But again, I'd need to watch a little bit more just to see what the triggers are in the wide areas, whether or not you're almost dropping players quickly without putting pressure on the ball player, whether or not they're getting easy balls into the box. I watched, it was the Brentford game, wasn't it, where you were exposed a few times from wide areas.
Yeah, the 3-3.
And I did watch that game. Nothing beyond that really stood out to me. I think it's easy to read too much into it when it happens a few times. But yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is probably personnel. Really, it's, if you don't have the personnel and this is the trade-off that you make with like a system like Emery's, right? Is that there are going to be it's very much the poor man's blanket that Rafa Benitez used to talk about, right? Whereas if you make decisions in one area, then it impacts you negatively in another area. Your blanket's too small, so you either have a cold head or you have cold feet, right? You have to make the decision. And I guess that's part of the Pau Torres thing, right? The trade-off that you're making is you'll have a fantastic centre-back at doing the build-up stuff that you're doing most of the time when you're in possession of the ball, versus occasionally he'll be caught out aerially. Because that's just a weakness that he has. So yeah, I think that I wouldn't worry too much about it, because I think they'll obviously be analysing it and working out why are we more susceptible. Whether or not that means that you're gonna, as I was talking about before, you'll develop better triggers for the wide areas so that players won't be getting crosses into the box quite so easily. I don't know, but yeah, I think part of the solution then will be in the transfer market, right? Maybe finding a right-sided centre back who you can pair with Torres that allows you to get away with his maybe aerial deficiencies, but offers a little bit more bulking in terms of the aerial presence at set pieces or crosses from wide.
I don't mean to dig out Matty Cash, that is what I'm about to do. I can think of a couple of occasions where you see the still of the offside trap where he's maybe been a VAR call or whatever, and Matty Cash is the guy who's 5 yards deeper than the rest, and he's playing them onside, and you think that's on him. Basically, if he's up with everybody else as he should be, Villa successfully complete the offside trap, and that goal never happens. And there's going to be moments like that.
That's what triggers as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to be like, oh, get rid of Matty Cash, he's not good enough. But in an individual, isolated moment, he's the one that has led to that thing by just not being where he's supposed to be. And I'll put that down to things like mental fatigue as well in certain games. That it's just taking so much energy and so much effort that various things are going to happen to mean that, well, he's not further back because maybe he's only just come on the pitch, or there's always going to be some kind of reason to explain those things away. And again, for me, not huge causes for concern that Villa are structurally bad. It's just that a moment's happened where it's that one that led to a goal as well of all ones.
And I think, as I said before, it's like I think every team at the level that Villa are operating at are going to have these weak areas. That the only way you solve it is by just getting better players, right? There comes a point when it's the same thing with Roberto De Zerbi. Like he gets panned all the time for being a very idealistic coach, and the similarities between De Zerbi and Unai Emery in many respects, right? It's like a lot of the same kind of ideas, different structural enactments of the same ideas, but sit deep, bait opponents in to create space to then attack transitionally. And the way that you defend, there's clear weaknesses to both systems, and people just say, well, why if these coaches were really elite, they wouldn't be weak in any area. They should be like Pep Guardiola. They should be like Mikel Arteta. And there's arguments to be made that these coaches could be smarter, perhaps. I don't even want to say that, because I don't think it is smarter. But I think so much of it then comes down to the squad that you have available to you. Like Man City are built to be able to, as we talked about before, squeeze the opponent into the final third, which makes it hard to break down the low block, but makes it easier to defend because there's more distance for them to go to the goal. So what you do is you bring in better players, just elite players for breaking down low blocks, which is just really good players, right? When it's at that level, it's just bring in Kevin De Bruyne and he puts it on a sixpence for Erling Haaland, and lo and behold, it's quite easy to break down low blocks from that situation. The other thing is, you do have a weakness in transition because you're so aggressive in your positioning that you do leave space in behind. And in the Premier League now, there's enough players who can punish that. So what do you do? Well, you bring in 5 centre backs that are all elite ball players, but also elite defensive players, all elite in defensive transition, pretty much, and you never get scored on. How's Pep Guardiola done that? Yes, there's tactics involved, but he's done that by having the ability to field elite players in every position. If you're a manager like Emery, you simply can't do that. If you're a manager like De Zerbi, you can't do that. You have to rely on the fact that you have to make those tactical trade-offs, and you have to say, what do we want to be really good at?
Yeah.
And in this situation, they've decided we want to be good at like transition attacking. The best way of causing problems in the Premier League is to pull opponents out so that there's space to attack, and we're going to have players who can then punish those moments. It works really well. It does mean that occasionally that like Brighton get caught out in defensive transition because they're playing Billy Gilmore, an 11-year-old child, and Pascal Gross, one of the slowest players to ever have lived, right, in their central midfield. Gives them a huge amount of upside in possession. Out of possession, there are weaknesses. What do you do? You can't. The other option is just sit deep and then never score any goals. And I think the same is true, right, of Villa, right? The tactical trade-offs are there. But what can you do at this level? You can only afford to bring in a centre back who's good at build up stuff or aerially, right? That's the difference between bringing someone like Pau Torres and bringing someone like, I don't know, someone like John Stones, right? That's the decision that you have to make, and it's a financial decision. And at this point, Villa simply can't just up their squad like that. With a click. So there's always going to be weaknesses. You're going to have to accept that is the case until you have a squad that competes with Man City. And who knows when that happens or if that happens. So for now, like I would be much more sanguine about it and say, at least we know what our weaknesses are, and we can work on that in pre-season. We can bring in players to try and help us offset those things. We're in the Champions League now, so we can maybe tempt players who are going to be approaching that elite level where they're going to be good in build-up and defensively, etc. That's just the reality of modern football. And like Villa, as a neutral, I'm always aware coming on these things that as a neutral, I don't want to piss Villa fans off. But at the moment, where you're at is you aren't. I would say you aren't a top 4 squad. I think you've played well enough to deserve the top 4 this season. But the reality is that happens when you have a good season, when you're a squad like Villa. Whereas, for a squad like Man City, it's the reality that you should be getting top 4 every season.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the reality that Villa should be getting top 4 every season with this squad. And so right now you have to just accept that there will be weaknesses and you have to do your best to offset those. But if you can do that well enough for a season, you can get into the top 4.
Yeah, and it makes the achievement that Villa have done this season all the more incredible, that the limitation they've had, that they can't just go out and spend basically what they want. They can't say, Matty Cash isn't quite doing it. Can I please have a £60 million right back, please? Like Pep has kind of spent millions and millions upon just positions that they need because they can attract players because of revenue and breaking the rules potentially, blah, 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 blah. Villa can't do that and won't do that and have to spend reasonably, and that is what they will continue to do. And they've punched above their weight by finishing 4th. I predicted them to finish 4th at the start of the season. We said as early as November, Villa are contenders for this if they have a good season. But most Villa fans will agree that if Villa went into next season now with exactly the same squad, it'd be a struggle. Like the Champions League is going to be really difficult to progress into. To finish 4th again would take an incredible feat. Getting Kamara back, Ramsey back, Mings, Buendia already adds 3 or 4 options that Villa didn't have this year. So that makes the squad stronger. But you still need probably 3 or 4 signings to still beef that squad up a little bit to be competitive again. I'd still expect Villa to be good enough to finish in the top 6, personally, but it will take another mammoth effort to finish 4th or better. But as Villa fans, we will all back the club to make the right decisions to do that. We're not saying it's easy, but it's certainly achievable. But this squad, I think somebody else said it. I don't know who that was, actually. They said that like this squad shouldn't have finished 4th. That was Gary Neville on Monday Night Football. It's like this. If you look at that squad, they shouldn't be 4th. And Villa fans kind of took that negatively as like, oh, Gary Neville's disrespecting our players. I don't think it was that. I think he was saying they've punched they've done so well to achieve what they have because that squad isn't as good as what Chelsea should have on paper or Man United should have on paper. But Emery's got them ticking in the right way, that players who are not as good as some of the others are performing well above their levels and have got us to where we are. Yeah,
absolutely. And look, this is football fandom. Football fandom is enhanced by that, I think. Like, I don't know what it'd be like to be a fan of a club where the reality is that they have financial advantages. I would love to support a club who had a manager who's able to get more out of the squad that he has at his disposal, and then is able to solve problems as they arise, and then have a recruitment department who are able to enhance what the squad can achieve. Right, that's what football fandom should be all about. Having a club where they're doing things, and you're like, I trust them to make good decisions to make us more competitive. Yeah.
Because when Gerrard had this squad, pretty much the same squad in 17th, he had Kamara at the time. Obviously, Emery's had half a season without him. Moussa Diaby played in every game, which is pretty mad, really. So he's obviously signed him. Pau Torres was his man, and Tielemans as well, with kind of the three big ones from the summer, and then Morgan Rogers in January, Moreno and Duran in the January before. So Emery's made 6 or 7 signings to help this squad. But ultimately, a lot of the players that were underachieving under Dean Smith and Steven Gerrard, Emery's gone in there and made them well above their market value, what they should have been. Like John McGinn was probably, he said himself on a stage of thinking, I might be on the way out here. And Villa fans maybe thinking, I don't know, 20 or 30 million for John McGinn. I have no idea. I'm crap at values. Whereas now you go, well, he's our captain. He's took us from the Championship to the Champions League. We wouldn't sell him anyway, but if we were to, you'd be talking double that value because Emery's made him so much better.
Yeah.
And I love that approach to football rather than just thinking, this isn't working. I need 200 million to fix this. It's like, no, well, if I tweak his position, change his role, do this, do that, all of a sudden, this squad that was struggling to kind of string passes together can now evolve a whole new style of play and be successful at it. Is such a lovely feeling.
I'm a Leeds fan. Marcelo Bielsa was the best thing to ever happen to our club. He took a mid-table Championship side to the Premier League and got them finishing mid-table. It's like I'd take that over anything. Like it was so satisfying because it was wholesome, right? That's what it is. It's wholesome. It's like football as it's supposed to be. I mean, okay, like the reality of it is
millions and millions.
Right, exactly. It's still the reality of modern football and like finances, and that stuff is depressing. But within the context, I think it's about as wholesome as it can get, and I think that's important for football fans. It's important. It's everyone thinks about winning trophies as the most important thing, but I just don't think it's true. I think to be able to watch your team week in, week out, like the players, like the manager, have faith that they're going to make the best decisions. It's massively underrated amongst football fans.
Yeah. Dean says, I saw some interesting running stats putting Villa at bottom of the league for distance covered. I think this was Monday Night Football again. I'm interested in this because the prevailing narrative is usually that running more is better. This is surely intentional. And Sam says, we've done really well at conserving energy on the pitch. We're right near the bottom in terms of distance ran. Is this sustainable? And will we have to adapt this in the Champions League? So obviously this stat came from Monday Night Football, I think, from the Liverpool game, and Villa's kind of distance covered and a couple of different stats that I don't have in front of me. Villa were ranked either bottom or near the bottom, and the kind of narrative was, well, that's a bad thing, isn't it? Like not running is probably bad, but we saw with a different stat at one stage during the back end of the season that Emi Martinez had more seconds on the ball than any player, any outfield player, and any player throughout the entirety of the league because of getting the ball, standing on it, waiting for things to happen. That is obviously absolutely intentional to play that way. We have not been found out here as lacking effort or desire or anything like that. This is the way we play. We know this, but when we do kind of burst into action, it's kind of all or nothing, isn't it? We have these fleeting moments where we go bang, 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 bang. Oh my God, we've scored. Whereas other times it's like, okay, this is calm. We'll all just sit back, and that will affect the data that it looks like Villa aren't doing much.
Yeah, it's funny. I've got a script hanging around which I never actually recorded in the end because there was comments made by Andoni Iraola, the Bournemouth manager, after playing Villa. And I think before the game he'd been asked whether or not he was worried. He was like feeling confident because Villa had played in Europe midweek, and he said, "I don't think that comes into it at all because of the way they play. The way that they play is designed to sort of conserve energy." Look, I read this whole script then being like, we always talk about teams that burn out. Why do we never talk about the teams that don't burn out? But then I saw so many Villa fans in that week just talking about how all the players look burnt out that I chickened out and never made the video. But it's an interesting one because like there does seem to be sort of a contradiction there between the way that Villa play and the fact that the fans were very much like, oh, the team have burned out. I guess a lot of that comes down to what we've talked about before, which is only using a core of 14 players. And so even with that more conservative play style, it got to them in the end, willing to concede on that point. But yeah, you're entirely right. Like the play style is not energy intensive. So we talked about how you like to build up deep, bait opponents in. If the opponents don't get baited in, then you just get time to chill out on the ball. And it comes back to what we were talking about before, the ability to control games in game state moments. So yeah, against Chelsea, they weren't willing to just allow you to sit deep with the ball. They went hunting after you and caused you to play it long, and it made the game transitional. But a lot of teams will simply just sit back and say, we're not going to get baited in, because if we do, then we are going to open space, which you're probably going to hurt us from. So for the majority of time, you are doing that sort of defending in possession of the ball. The other thing to say is like out of possession, you have a fairly lax mid block. I say lax in the sense that it's not hugely energy intensive. I think that paired with the high line has worked really well this season. But it's not, you don't press up hugely aggressively at any point. And again, that is a arguments to be made that part of the reason why Arsenal sort of tailed off at the end of the season was because they are so aggressive out of possession, and they do have to run around a lot. And what we saw at the end of the season from them was them actually being much more happy to sit in a mid block and not commit too far forward. So again, the two aspects of your in possession and out of possession play, yes, there's moments where players have to sprint a lot, both in the back line and in the forward areas, but for the majority of the time you are given recovery periods, and I think in the long run, bulk out the squad, have a broader core of players that you can bring in and rotate, and in future seasons that should I say advisedly work itself out as you being able to actually get long-term benefits and not burning out at the end of seasons as well. So yeah, no concerns whatsoever about running stats. Running stats don't tell you anything other than like which team was running more. But running more is not better than running less, as long as the tactics help you out there.
I'm going to combine two questions here from Dave Reed and Alex. Dave, first of all, says, I'm interested in how Jon thinks Villa will evolve tactically in 2024-2025. Villa were efficient out of possession, but do they need to be more aggressive to close the gap on City and Arsenal? And Alex says, if Villa want to maintain a top four challenge again next season, obviously the numbers since March haven't been great. What's the one thing Jon would say is critical to improve?
So I think to really make the next step up, Villa have to become more well-rounded. I think that's it's what we were talking about before, right? De Zerbi and Emery get a huge amount out of this, their teams, their squads, because they make very specific decisions about what they're going to do in and out of possession. So they're very good at certain things. We just talked about how Villa like really good at like deep build-up, creating these transitional moments or these artificially transitional moments, but also out of possession, sit in a mid-block and have a really aggressive back line. Absolutely elite at both of those things, but when you come up against teams that can cause problems for those two things, then you face issues, right? We've already talked about it with the Chelsea game, but I guess any team that can cause problems against your back line, I don't know. I think you maybe, I don't know. I don't remember what happened in the Man United games for you guys, but they're usually pretty good at like causing problems for high lines in that respect. As soon as that kind of thing happens, then what do you do?
Yeah.
And the really elite teams are just they're able to be dominant in every phase of the game against every type of opponent and have solutions for it. So I think for me, the next step for Villa is to move to a position where, yes, you can do great box defending. Yes, you can do great mid-block defending. Yes, you can do aggressive high presses against opponents that require it. Yes, you've got a great counter press. Yes, you've got good rest defense, all out of possession, or in possession, I guess, with rest defense. But then in possession, yes, we can possess the ball deep in our own half, build it around and move it. But what about possessing the ball in the midfield area? What about the ball progression from the first few phases into the final third? What about, as I said before, what the big teams do, squeezing opponents into a low block? What about them breaking down that low block? What about transition attacking? All of the big teams can do all of those things. They're elite at all of them. And that's, if you want to really compete at the highest level, you just have to keep adding elements, tactical elements to your game. That means that, and have the flexibility to be able to move between them. So that when you come up against an opponent, I mean, again, the FA Cup final is a great example of that. Man City played really badly in the first half for a number of reasons. But in the second half, they came out and they basically dominated the game. Now, there was obviously game state effects there because Man United were 2-0 up at that point. But from a tactical point of view, the changes they made meant that they then were the dominant team. That's what you get from these elite teams. And I think with teams like, De Zerbi and Emery, I know I keep bundling the two of them together, but the problem is sometimes you come up against an opponent and he just finds you out a little bit, and you don't get the impression that anything can happen other than, well, we're just gonna have to take our medicine in this game. So I think for me that's the next evolution that will have to happen. And I suppose there are questions about whether or not Emery can do that. That's the reason why people would claim that Emery can't be an elite coach. I think that's unfair to a degree. I also think that he has the capacity to, if he can keep going well with Villa, to develop his game, to really to move Villa into the really elite level, but also move himself into the elite level, because he hasn't had a huge amount of opportunities to do that so far. And I think the next few seasons are going to be important for us, for him in his own career, if he can start developing those aspects into his game. And look, he's a details guy, so, and he'll be aware of these things. So I think that that's the questions that will be, I guess, put at his door. But whatever happens, he has taken Villa from one level to another. That would be what I would be thinking about Unai Emery and Villa over the next couple of seasons. Can you add more of those areas to your strings to your bow, become dominant in more phases of the game, and as a result make it harder and harder for teams to find you out in that sense? Do
you think Emery personally and the club and the squad that he's building can continue to progress and get better, even if the league position isn't as good? It
is really tough without incredible financial backing. You basically have to not make any missteps, really, to be able to make that kind of step up. Whereas a club like Manchester City can sign Calvin Phillips for £42.5 million and then barely use him. That sort of thing would be disastrous for a club like Villa, I think. So yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely possible. But again, there's so many moving parts, right? You have to get the squad up so that then the squad is good enough for Emery to evolve to a point where actually he is doing the stuff that we're talking about, like dominating possession, not in a sort of sit deep and hit on the counter or hit in transition, but to possess the ball further up the field. And it's hard to do that. It's tough to coach that, and it's tough to maintain the finances to be able to build a squad that is functionally able to do that. So it is really tough. But I mean, like I said before, this is what football fandom's about, right? It's hoping that your club can do that, and hoping that the right moves are made. And certainly a club that made that step up would look like what Villa have done in the last couple of seasons, right? So positivity there.
Just a final question then to end it away from Villa, from Hulberto, who says, I want to learn more about analytics in football. Does John have any advice on this? Maybe books, or what tools are best to help produce reports?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you mean by analytics. If by analytics you mean like data analysis, then I'm probably not the best expert to talk about this. If it's tactical analysis, then my advice, I guess it would port over relatively similarly to the data analytics side. But anyone who wants to, I think, understand the game better, like the number one rule I always have is just watch more football. If you want to understand football, there's no cheat code. It's like any area of expertise. I get people all the time being like, how do I get to do what you do? As though it's just sort of like you do a certificate and then you do a course for 6 weeks and then it's like, here you go, you're a tactical analyst. It's you basically, you have to become an expert in the thing that you're talking about, and that involves spending hours and hours and hours watching stuff. And
like the 10,000 hours thing, something like 100 hours to be a novice, 10,000 hours in a certain thing to be an expert, something like that.
Yeah, I think there has been research done on that kind of thing. But yeah, it's the reality. If you want to become like a master craftsman, you have to spend hours and hours and years of apprenticeships just understanding the area that you're working in. It's the same in football. Football is not an easy game. It's a very complex game. I feel as though I still feel uncomfortable describing myself as an expert because I don't feel as though I am. But I spend a ton of time preparing for this. I watched 10 Villa games from the end of the season, which a lot of people I don't think would understand that that's the sort of commitment that you have to put in if you want to, for me anyway, to come onto a podcast like this and talk about it with any sense of authority. I feel as though I have to, because you guys have watched all of the games, and so what can I add if I haven't watched those games to you guys? So that it takes time and it takes effort, and it's a really slow development, because it's not like you watch a game and you're like, this game I learned this, and then next game I learned that. A lot of it is slow learning over a long period, and it's hard, man. It's like, sometimes there's nothing less that I want to do than sit down and watch a game of football, but it's my job, and boo-hoo, it's a great job. I'm very lucky to do what I do, but it's like any job. There are times when it is hard work.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the number one rule. What if you want to get good at analyzing football? Watch a lot of football. Twitter, I think, is a good resource. I think as time goes on, it becomes more hit and miss. But find people whose views you generally or opinions you find generally good, and follow them and see what they do, and try and get a sense of how they view the game. The other thing that I found really useful was, so I started out covering Marcelo Bielsa's Leeds, and I just sort of fully immersed myself in just him mainly at that point, and got a real tactical grounding in the way that he viewed football. And then I used that as a baseline to then go elsewhere and be like, oh, what about this coach? And then I'd be like, well, this is different from what Bielsa does. This is similar to what he does. And then before you know it, then you become a bit more of an expert in another coach. And then what you start doing is you develop this network of ideas. But starting with like a one coach who I think anyway, or one school of tactics, and just getting really ingrained in that, and then using that as a bedrock to found your other ideas, I think is useful as well. Collaboration, I think, is super important. I think people really struggle to collaborate because it's hard. I get that. I think we live in a knowledge economy in social media, where it feels as though, I've got to keep all of these ideas to myself, and this has got to be my thing, and I don't want to engage with other people. But absolutely, the best ideas that I've come up with have usually been through conversations with other people. Those things are really, really important. And maybe final point, just always constantly have to reassess your ideas. Your takes will never be 100% correct forever. And most of the time when I'm right on a thing, it's largely by luck, I would say. So just having a level of humility to accept that your opinion could be wrong, that we have incredible biases, and we want to be right. And sometimes that means that we don't back down on something where we actually deep down know that we probably are a bit wrong. And also the idea that, like, what even is the right opinion on these things? An open-mindedness, a humility, and a willingness to admit that we can always reassess our priors and reassess our takes. And if you can do that, then I think you're a much better analyst, because you're much more nimble. You're much more able to change your mind on things and follow trends, because tactical world is evolving all the time. So there's just a few off the top of my head, like, pieces of advice for people wanting to get better at analysis.
No, it's really good, really useful. And I say every season, or at the start of every season, I'm going to try more this year. Obviously I watch every Villa game, and I'll watch stuff back, whether it be full games or extended highlights. But I always think I'm going to try and watch more football this year. I'm going to try and take more. I'm going to read more. Time is such an underrated factor that comes into it.
Absolutely.
To have the time to watch a game every day, or multiple games on a single night, or whatever it is, it's just so difficult to do. So yeah, huge respect for the effort that you put into stuff, because it's a serious undertaking. A big thank you to coming on to Jon. Thanks for the questions as well, submitted on Twitter last week or earlier this week, whenever this is going out. For those that are listening to this podcast, there is a special video on our YouTube channel called 5 Years On that I worked on with Dan Bardell. I would urge you to go and have a watch of that. We think it's very good, and there's been a great reaction to it as well. Those that are watching on YouTube, there will be a link to that video on Jon's face. I will put it there now on screen, so you can click there and go and watch that video. We'd be very grateful for you to go and have a watch and let us know what you think. Jon, thanks for your time. Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.